Today's reading is taken from a book called World War Z, written by Max Brooks. It gives a fictional account of a zombie war that almost eradicated humanity and follows several characters across several different countries and how they reacted to the zombie outbreak. Here are your 3 comprehension questions. Number 1. Who is patient 0? Number 2. How do we know that the mother is upset? And number 3. How can we tell that Dr. Gu Wen Kuei finds the situation very serious? I found patient 0 behind the locked door of an abandoned house across town. He was 12 years old. His wrists and feet were bound with plastic packing twine. Although he'd rubbed off the skin around his bonds, there were no blood. There was no blood on his other wounds, not one on the gouges on his legs or arms or from the large dry gap where his right big toe had been. He was writhing like an animal. A gag muffled his growls. At first, the villagers tried to hold me back. They warned me not to touch him, that he was cursed. I shrugged them off and reached for my mask and gloves. The boy's skin was as cold and grey as the cement on which he lay. I could find neither his heartbeat nor his pulse. His eyes were wild, wide, and sunken back in their sockets. They remained locked onto me like a predatory beast. Throughout the examination, he was inexplicably hostile, reaching for me with his bound hands and snapping at me through his gag. His movements were so violent I had to call for 2 of the largest villagers to help me hold him down. Initially, they wouldn't budge, cowering in the doorway like baby rabbits. I explained that there was no risk of infection if they used gloves and masks. When they shook their heads, I made it an order, even though I had no lawful authority to do so. That was all it took. The 2 oxen men knelt beside me. One held the boy's feet, while the other grasped his hands. I tried to take a blood sample, and instead extracted only a brown viscous matter. As I was withdrawing the needle, the boy began another bout of violent struggling. One of my orderlies, the one responsible for his arms, gave up trying to hold them, and thought it might be safer if he just braced them against the floor with his knees. But the boy jerked again, and I heard his left arm snap. Jagged ends of both radius and ulnar bones stabbed through his grey flesh. Although the boy didn't cry out, he didn't even seem to notice. It was enough for both assistants to leap back and run from the room. I instinctively retreated several paces. I am embarrassed to admit this. I've been a doctor for most of my adult life, and I was trained and you could even say raised by the People's Liberation Army. I've treated more than my share of combat injuries, faced my own death on more than one occasion, and now I was scared, I was truly scared, of this frail child. The boy began to twist in my direction. His arm ripped completely free, flesh and muscle tore from one another until there was nothing except the stump. His now free right arm, still tied to the severed left hand, dragged his body across the floor. I hurried outside, locking the door behind me. I tried to compose myself and control my fear and shame. My voice cracked as I asked the villagers how the boy had been infected. No one answered. A young woman came forward. Maybe his mother. You could tell that she had been crying for days. Her eyes were dry and deeply red. She admitted that it had happened while the boy and his father were moon fishing, a term that describes diving for treasure among the sunken ruins of the Three Gorges Reservoir. With more than 1,100 abandoned villages, towns, and even cities, there was always the hope of recovering something valuable. It was a common practice in those days and also very illegal. She explained they weren't looting, that it was their old village in Duchang, and they were just trying to recover some heirloom from the remaining houses that hadn't been moved. She repeated the point, and I had to interrupt her with promises not to inform the police. She finally explained the boy came up crying with a bite mark on his foot. He didn't know what had happened. The water had been too dark and muddy. His father had never been seen again. I reached for my cell phone and dialed the number of Dr. Gu Wen Kuei, an old comrade from my army days who now worked in the Institute for Infectious Diseases at Chongqing University. We exchanged pleasantries, as was proper, and then I told him about the outbreak, and he listened. Almost reluctantly, he asked me what the symptoms were. I told him everything, the bites, the fever, the boy, the arm. His face suddenly stiffened, his smile died. He asked me to show him the infected. I went back into the meeting hall and waved the phone's camera over each of the patients. He asked me to move the camera closer to some of the wounds themselves. I did so. When I brought the screen back to my face, I saw the video image had been cut. "Stay where you are," he said, just a distant voice. "Remove now. Take the names of all you have had contact with the infected. Restrain those already infected. If any have passed into coma, vacate the room and secure the exit." His voice was flat and robotic, as if he had rehearsed his speech or was reading it from something. He asked me, "Are you armed?" "Why would I be?" he asked. He told me he would get back to me. All business again. He said he had to make a few phone calls, and that I should expect support in a few hours. Here are your answers. Number 1. A 12-year-old boy who has sustained a bite mark is cold and thrashing around. Number 2. His mother is clearly upset because she has been crying for days and her eyes are dry and deeply red. And number 3. The doctor demands images of those that are infected and gives clear instructions on how they are to be dealt with. Thank you for listening to this Drop Everything and Listen. Please let me know if you've enjoyed it and if you have any book recommendation in the comments below. Thank you.